The rain hammered the ER windows like a warning no one heard. Sarah gripped the rail and said, "Tell me he is stable." Dr. Patel met her eyes and inhaled like the air hurt. He said, "Your father needs an urgent match." The word father rang too loud in the sterile room. Machines beeped like clocks with no mercy. Dr. Patel said, "Your sample did not match for kinship." Her breath snagged, and the floor felt like glass. Margaret whispered, "There is something we never told you." Sarah said, "Not now," but the words shook loose anyway. The night smelled of bleach and fear. Truth crept in like a cold hand on her neck. Dr. Patel said, "We must be honest to save him." Sarah stared at Daniel's pale face, and a door in her life swung open to a dark hall. The vending machine hummed like a bad lullaby as Sarah counted breaths. She said, "We will fix this," and the word we felt thinner than paper. A security guard passed, tipping his hat to no one. Margaret sat small in the corner, a shadow unstitched. Sarah remembered Daniel teaching her to ride a bike, his hands steady on the seat. She said, "He never let go until I believed I could." The memory burned bright, then dimmed under the new weight. Dr. Patel's sentence hovered like frost. Sarah said, "I will sign whatever you need," and the pen in her hand felt heavier than grief. Paperwork stacked like small storms. Dr. Patel said, "For transplant screening we need accurate history." The words pried at locked doors. Sarah said, "He is my father," and the air thinned. Margaret watched her, eyes drowning in apology. A nearby monitor chimed like a metronome set to dread. Sarah signed forms with a hand that would not steady. She said, "Tell me what you need to save him," and swallowed a shard of silence. The pen scratched, and with it, certainty bled away. They sat in a small consult room with chairs that pretended to be kind. Dr. Patel said, "The kinship test indicates non-parental relation." The syllables landed like glass beads. Sarah blinked, and the room shifted a degree colder. She said, "There is a mistake," but the folder did not flinch. Margaret whispered, "We meant to tell you when it mattered less." The clock stuttered on the wall. Sarah said, "When would that be?" and her voice sounded borrowed. The silence after felt like the longest corridor in the building. The storm outside slowed to a steady whisper. Sarah stood by the window and watched rain stitch lines on the glass. She said, "If I was not theirs, why did every memory feel true?" Margaret murmured, "Because love makes its own blood." Daniel's monitor beeped like a heartbeat, trying to be brave. Sarah said, "We save him first," and the words steadied her spine. The future yawned wide, full of records and questions with teeth. She pressed her palm to the glass, cool as a new fact. She said, "After this, we open every door." The cafeteria lights buzzed like tired bees, casting pale shadows across cracked tiles. Sarah pushed away a cold coffee, her reflection broken in the surface. She said, "I feel like I never knew my own name." Margaret sat opposite, fingers twisting her wedding ring, eyes fixed on a past she could not bury. She whispered, "We chose silence because we feared losing you." The clatter of a tray somewhere in the back punctured the quiet. Sarah pressed her palms flat against the table, as if anchoring herself. She said, "But silence cost me trust," and her throat burned with unshed words. The air smelled of reheated broth, but beneath it lingered the metallic weight of betrayal. Sarah wandered the quiet hospital garden, air damp with midnight drizzle. The benches glistened under sodium lamps, leaves sagging heavy. She said, "He raised me as if blood was never needed." The memory of Daniel's laughter echoed like a ghost. Sarah's breath fogged in the cool night, a fragile proof she was still here. She recalled bedtime stories, Daniel's voice calm and patient, painting worlds safer than their own. The words she whispered now felt more like questions than statements. She said, "What am I without the truth?" and the wind moved as if carrying no answer. Her hands pressed to her chest, needing reassurance only the past refused to give. Inside the chapel, candles flickered in shallow breaths of air. Stained glass fractured the moonlight into muted blues and reds across the pews. Sarah sat alone, eyes closed, but the silence only screamed louder. She whispered, "If love made us family, why does this feel like loss?" Wooden pews creaked with her shifting weight, a fragile sound. Her hands tightened together in prayer, though she was unsure who she prayed to. The air smelled of old wax and dust, like secrets waiting too long. She remembered Margaret's first lullaby, soft and trembling, and wondered if lies had been sung into her sleep. She said, "All I ever wanted was truth that did not break me." Margaret found Sarah in the chapel doorway, voice breaking like porcelain dropped. She said, "You were never meant to feel less loved." Sarah turned, her eyes wet with fury and ache. She said, "Then why do I feel abandoned in my own life?" Margaret reached forward, her hand hesitant, trembling in air. The chapel's candlelight wavered over her face, softening lines carved by guilt. The silence between them became heavier than any words. Sarah said, "You built my world on a foundation you never meant me to stand on." Margaret lowered her gaze, and in the hush of that room, regret became almost physical. Back in the ICU, machines hummed steady as though mocking fragile hearts. Daniel lay still, skin pale under sterile light, breath shallow but present. Sarah sat close, her fingers brushing the blanket edge. She whispered, "You are still my father, even if paper disagrees." Margaret lingered by the wall, silent and small, as if her presence might break what little peace remained. Sarah's tears fell soundlessly, absorbed by cotton and night. She said, "I will fight for you," and the word sounded like a vow hammered into iron. For one fragile heartbeat, her anger bent into love that refused to loosen its grip. The morning sun cracked pale through blinds, slicing bars of light across the ICU floor. Sarah had not slept, her eyes hollow but burning. She whispered, "Every lie builds a wall I never asked for." Margaret sat with her back straight, voice shaking as she said, "We thought silence was love, but silence was a prison." Sarah pressed her palms against her knees, as though grounding herself against collapse. Daniel's monitor beeped steady, a cruel reminder of life that demanded answers. The nurse adjusted a drip bag without a word, the sound of liquid dripping echoing like seconds lost. Sarah said, "I can't fight shadows if you won't tell me what they are." The hallway outside buzzed with hurried footsteps, but Sarah's world stayed narrowed. She said, "Every glance feels like a stranger's reflection." Margaret stepped closer, her voice trembling. She said, "You were chosen, not abandoned." The words struck like fire and soot at once. Sarah gripped the railing, knuckles whitening, as memories she trusted fractured. A janitor pushed a mop down the corridor, the squeak and swish sounding almost mocking in the silence. Sarah said, "Chosen still means someone left me first." Margaret's face twisted, guilt pouring out in silence, heavier than noise. In the stairwell, voices carried upward, every echo stretching Sarah's heartbeat. She said, "I don't know who I am anymore." Margaret reached for her, but Sarah stepped back, shadow falling across her face. Margaret whispered, "You are mine in every way that counts." The stairwell light flickered, casting broken shapes on the walls. Sarah's chest rose heavy, each inhale like lifting stone. A memory of childhood laughter bubbled, now poisoned with doubt. She pressed her hand against the cold railing, whispering, "Then why does my blood argue with you?" Sarah sat alone in the hospital parking lot, the morning fog curling like secrets unspoken. Her phone buzzed with calls she ignored, screen lighting her pale face. She said, "Everyone wants to know what I can't answer." Cars passed with muted hums, each taillight fading like fleeting truths. She pressed her forehead to her knees, whispers breaking out of her like cracks in glass. She said, "Am I a daughter, or am I an echo someone tried to erase?" The cold concrete pressed against her palms, solid, in a world that no longer felt real. By mid-morning, Sarah returned to the ICU, her steps heavier but steadier. Margaret looked up, fear etched deep, but Sarah's gaze no longer flickered. She said, "We save him. Then we face everything else." Margaret whispered, I only wanted to keep you safe. The monitor beeped in slow rhythm, Daniel's fragile chest rising under the thin blanket. Sarah sat down and reached for his hand, fingers curling around his fragile skin. She said, "Blood or not, you are my father." The truth hung unfinished, but in that room, love took the shape of survival. The file room was colder than the hall outside, as if secrets had their own climate. Sarah pulled a heavy folder free, dust lifting like ghosts into the air. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded a certificate too official, too final. She whispered, "This signature isn't his." Margaret lingered at the doorway, her frame small against the stacks of hidden truths. She said, "Some things were buried because love felt too fragile to hold their weight." The words cracked like old wood. The fluorescent light above flickered, buzzing shadows shifting across Sarah's face. The ink on the paper felt alive, clawing at her chest. She pressed her thumb against the page, as if pressure could force it to change. She whispered, "Every line screams that my life was built on silence." Margaret closed her eyes and leaned on the doorframe, as if too weak to carry what years of deception had hardened inside her. The staff lounge was nearly empty, humming with the faint sound of a broken vending machine light. Sarah sat at the table, papers spread in chaotic circles, her breath quick and shallow. She muttered, adopted in silence, hidden like a secret no one wanted spoken. Margaret stood nearby, her hands twisting together, words bleeding out slowly. She said, "We feared the cruelty of the world, the questions, the stares." Sarah's hands shook as she held up a record, the edges biting into her palm. She hissed, "Protection is only betrayal painted as love." A mug rattled as her fists struck the table, the ceramic echoing like glass breaking. Margaret's eyes welled, but her lips stayed sealed, silence chaining her. Sarah whispered, "If lies kept me safe, then safety was a cage I never agreed to." The room pressed in, suffocating with every unspoken memory. The bathroom mirror reflected a version of Sarah she barely recognized. Her eyes were red, skin pale under the harsh fluorescent glare. Water dripped from the faucet in slow, stubborn beats, each drop counting her unraveling. She whispered, "Who is this staring back at me?" Her reflection fractured where the mirror was chipped, her face broken into shards. Childhood memories cut in, Daniel's steady voice teaching her shoelaces, Margaret singing lullabies in low whispers. But every recollection now felt rewired, tainted by omission. Steam began to cloud the glass from a heater vent, her features blurring as if her identity dissolved in real time. She said, "Am I anyone's truth, or just a shadow of someone else's choice?" Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the sink, body trembling under weight she could not name. The silence in the room was louder than her heartbeat. Sarah stepped into the corridor and found Dr. Patel reviewing a chart, his shoulders heavy with unspoken knowledge. Her voice cut the quiet. "You knew, didn't you, before you told me?" He lowered his eyes, his silence more truthful than denial. The hallway smelled sharp with antiseptic, as if sterile air could clean dirty secrets. Finally, Dr. Patel spoke softly, "Truth is like medicine, it burns before it heals." Sarah's fists tightened until her nails dug crescents into her palms. She said, "You let me break without warning, as if strength could be forced out of shattering." His gaze softened, his words weighed with honesty. "Strength is born in pain, even when the timing is cruel." The corridor stretched endlessly behind them, pale walls and polished floors amplifying the emptiness. Sarah turned away, her breath jagged, every step echoing her fracture. The night outside the hospital was brutally cold, wind cutting sharp as glass. Floodlights bathed the courtyard in hard white, shadows pooling under the benches. Sarah sat with her arms folded, voice nearly a whisper. If blood lied, then love must be all that remains. Margaret joined her, sitting slow, hands folded in her lap like folded prayers. The stars blurred against city glow, their light dimmed by distance and smog. Sarah said, "You should have trusted me with pain, not buried me under silence." Margaret's voice quivered. "We feared losing you more than we feared the truth itself." Sarah stared upward, jaw set, breath visible in the freezing air. For the first time that night, she let herself sit beside Margaret without pulling away. The silence stretched, not as an enemy, but as a fragile truce waiting to be tested. The records lay scattered on the ICU table, their truth sharp as broken glass. Sarah traced the lines of her birth certificate, her chest rising like it carried bricks. She whispered, "Not his blood, not her body, yet their love was my life." Margaret's voice cracked. "We prayed you'd never need to see this." The words landed like stones on fragile glass. Daniel's shallow breaths filled the silence, the monitor's steady rhythm pressing the truth into her. Sarah pressed her hand against the edge of the bed, her voice quivering. "You gave me a world stitched together, but stitched with lies." Margaret said, "We gave you love, and we feared that truth would steal it." The moment felt like a wound exposed under hospital light, raw and throbbing, yet impossible to ignore. In the dim chapel again, Sarah sat beneath fractured colors of stained glass. She whispered, "If not theirs, then whose blood runs in me?" Margaret's shadow stretched down the aisle, her steps hesitant as if every footfall carried decades of weight. She said, "A woman we never knew, gone before you were old enough to remember." Sarah's breath shook, her fists clenched, her voice low. "So I was someone else lost before I was yours." The candles flickered violently, as though reacting to the storm inside her chest. Margaret lowered her head, hands folded like a penitent, and whispered, "You were never a replacement. You were always our answer." The silence wrapped them tight, like a prayer no one dared finish. In the hospital roof garden, wind pressed cold against Sarah's skin. She said, "The truth feels heavier than the lie ever did." Her eyes traced the skyline drowned in gray haze. Margaret's coat pulled tight around her, her voice low and trembling. She said, "We never wanted you to feel unwanted." Sarah's voice cracked, "But I was left, and you never let me choose to face that." The air smelled of rain and metal, the city pulsing far below like another life. Sarah's tears ran hot against the cold night, her chest racked. She whispered, "I deserved to know where I came from, even if it shattered me." Margaret's silence carried more than apology. It carried helplessness that had nowhere to go. Back in the sterile consult room, Dr. Patel closed a folder with careful finality. He said, "The donor list is thin, but we are pursuing every option." Sarah barely heard, her pulse still roaring with truth's aftershock. She whispered, "He is my father, whether blood says yes or no." Dr. Patel met her eyes, quiet but firm. "Family is more than DNA, but medicine demands answers." Sarah looked at Margaret, her face pale but burning with resolve. She said, "Then I'll fight the truth and the lie together if it saves him." Margaret's tears finally fell, streaks carving across skin hardened by years of silence. In that room, they were not enemies of truth but survivors clinging to the same fragile thread. Night pressed deep around the ICU, but Sarah stayed awake, fingers curled around Daniel's hand. She whispered, "Blood is only ink in your body, but love is fire, and fire is what raised me." The monitor beeped slow, steady, a fragile anchor in the storm. Margaret stood at the window, her reflection fractured in the glass. Sarah said, "We face this together, no matter where I came from." Margaret turned, her voice cracking. "You are my daughter, not by accident, not by chance, but by every choice I ever made." The words broke Sarah's anger like brittle glass. She laid her head against Daniel's arm and whispered, "Then we save him, and we learn to save us after." The moment burned with fragile peace, raw but alive. The ICU lights burned harsher than before, each beep from the monitor louder, crueler. Sarah stood at the foot of Daniel's bed, her voice breaking. "I don't care about papers. I only care about him breathing." Margaret wept quietly by the wall, clutching her cardigan like a shield. Dr. Patel stepped closer, his words steady. "Time is running short. The transplant match will decide his chance." Sarah's throat tightened, rage and fear twisting together. She whispered, "Then take me, take whatever you need." Her hands trembled as if her body might collapse under the weight of devotion. Margaret shook her head, crying out, "You can't fix this by tearing yourself apart." But Sarah's eyes stayed locked on Daniel, as if daring the universe to defy her. The hallway outside swarmed with urgency, but Sarah's focus tunneled. She pressed Margaret against the wall, her voice raw. "Why did you let me believe lies while he lay dying?" Margaret's tears spilled, her voice shaking. "Because the truth carried knives we thought you weren't ready to hold." Sarah's breath came fast, hands trembling as fury mixed with grief. She said, "And now I bleed for secrets I never asked for." Nurses rushed past, wheels of gurneys squeaking, fluorescent light strobing overhead. Margaret's voice cracked. "You were never less ours. You were always more than what blood could measure." Sarah turned away, pressing her palms to her face, her voice muffled but sharp. Love should never have been built on silence. Sarah fled to the stairwell, her sobs echoing against concrete walls. She pressed her palms to the railing, gasping, "Every step feels like a fall I can't stop." Margaret's footsteps followed, hesitant, every echo chasing her down. Sarah shouted, "Do you know what it feels like to not know who you are?" Her voice cracked against the cold steel. Margaret's voice shook from below. "I know what it feels like to fear losing the one thing that made me whole." Sarah's chest heaved, anger and grief colliding. She whispered, "You held me with love, but chained me with lies." Margaret's silence answered louder than words, her face crumpled in helplessness. The chapel felt suffocating now, candles trembling in weak halos. Sarah knelt at the altar, her voice barely holding. "If blood denies me, let love claim me." Margaret stood behind, trembling, words spilling. "You are my daughter, not because of paper, but because I chose you every day." Sarah turned, tears streaking her cheeks, voice sharp. "Then why didn't you trust me with that choice?" Margaret's face crumpled, hands folding into prayer. She could no longer speak. The stained glass above painted fractured reds and blues over Sarah's face, making her look split in two. She whispered, "I needed truth, not comfort, and you gave me comfort that tasted like lies." The silence in the chapel rang louder than bells. Back in Daniel's room, the storm reached its peak. Machines beeped urgent, his breath shallow. Sarah clutched his hand, voice breaking. "You are my father, no matter what ink or blood says." Margaret stood at his other side, whispering, "You were always our miracle." The monitor spiked, alarms screaming through the room. Dr. Patel rushed in, shouting instructions to nurses, urgency flooding the sterile air. Sarah bent over Daniel, tears falling onto his sheets, whispering, "Stay, please stay." Margaret's sobs rose, filling the room with raw ache. Amid the chaos, Sarah's vow cut through like a blade. "I will carry every truth and every lie, if it means keeping you alive." The climax hit like thunder in her chest. The alarms quieted, replaced by the soft hum of machines stabilizing Daniel's fragile breath. Sarah slumped in her chair, exhaustion carved into her face. She whispered, "You're still here, and that's enough." Margaret stood on the opposite side, clutching the rail like a lifeline. She murmured, "We almost lost him. And I almost lost you too." The monitor's steady rhythm filled the room, like a fragile promise to hold on. Sarah pressed her forehead to Daniel's hand, tears soaking his skin. She said, "No matter what truth tore open, my heart still belongs here." The sterile air was heavy, but for the first time in hours, it did not crush her. Margaret's trembling hand reached out, resting lightly on Sarah's shoulder, fragile and unspoken but real. Later in the hospital courtyard, the morning breeze carried the scent of wet earth. Sarah sat on a bench, eyes red but steadier, staring at the rising sun through trees. She whispered, "The truth broke me, but it didn't erase me." Margaret sat beside her, her voice low. "I built walls to keep you safe, but those walls also kept you from breathing." Sarah looked at her, tired but resolute, and said, "I deserved scars, not illusions." Birds stirred in branches above, their wings breaking the silence with fragile rhythm. Margaret reached for Sarah's hand, and this time Sarah did not pull away. their fingers entwined, not perfect, not healed, but stitched with choice. In the chapel once more, Sarah lit a candle, the flame trembling in her hand before settling. She whispered, "For the life that raised me and the blood I never knew." Margaret stood behind her, silent, watching her daughter claim both love and loss in one breath. The stained glass bathed Sarah's face in fractured light, painting her in colors of conflict and hope. She whispered, "I will carry both truths, because both are mine." Margaret's tears fell silently, her body folding slightly like a prayer undone. The candlelight flickered across the pews, shadows dancing like memories refusing to vanish. For the first time, Sarah's words felt like a vow she could live with. Back inside the ICU, Sarah sat close to Daniel, brushing his hair gently from his forehead. She whispered, "I don't need your blood to call you my father." Daniel stirred faintly, a twitch of his hand against hers, fragile but real. Margaret watched with quiet awe, her voice breaking. "He fought for you long before you could fight for yourself." Sarah closed her eyes, whispering, "Then I'll fight for him now, and for us." The monitor beeped steady, filling the silence with rhythm like a heartbeat shared. For the first time, Sarah's voice carried not only anger but acceptance that love was messy, painful, but still worth clinging to. The room felt less like a battlefield, and more like the fragile start of healing. Night returned, quiet and heavy, but Sarah stayed at Daniel's bedside. She whispered, "Every lie broke something in me, but every act of love rebuilt me too." The monitor pulsed softly, steady as her breath. Margaret rested in the chair nearby, her eyes closed, exhaustion pulling her down. Sarah leaned closer, her lips near Daniel's ear, and whispered, "You are my father, always. Nothing will take that from me." She pressed her head against his arm, her tears drying into his gown. The camera of her memory held still, framing a fragile piece, broken truths, but unbroken love. In that silence, Sarah's heart finally carried both grief and healing together, and it did not shatter.